welcome. You made it. Yvonne's son is here as well. What time is it for you now? An hour time. I have no idea some of the people what time zone there is. I already know. Okay, I think we can start. There was a little sensation a few months ago by a paper written by Dimitri and Raphaël Millière, talking about vector grounding. And we know what vectors are. I'm not sure what Dimitri means by grounding. So before I let him introduce himself, I'll make the suggestion that he starts by defining grounding for us, so that we're all further. Dimitri does speak French and Portuguese and Italian, so he'll introduce himself in French. Tell people who are appreciative of the fact that his level of French is better than the average Anglophone level of French. But then I'll let you, out of mercy, switch back to a third language so that you can begin to talk. Avec ça, je me présente Dimitri COELHO MOLLO en portugais, avec la bonne prononciation.
Okay, the audio is not so good anymore again for some reasons. So I missed the last things you said.
Yeah, I just asked you to pronounce your name in Portuguese.
Ah, right. So my name in Portuguese is Dimitri Coelho, but Mollo is actually Italian, so there is no Portuguese pronunciation.
And it means soft.
Sorry?
And it means soft.
Yeah, so in Italian it will be Dimitri COELHO MOLLO. In Portuguese, Dimitri COELHO MOLLO. But none of these pronunciations are fully correct.
No.
Correctly.
Je passe le volant. Introduce yourself.
Oui. So, bonjour à tous. Je suis très heureux d'être ici et merci à Stéphane pour l'invitation. Mon français n'est pas très bien, mais je vais éprouver à me présenter en français, mais puis je vais parler pour la présentation en anglais. So, je suis un philosophe de les sciences. Je suis basé ici à Umeå, dans le nord de la Suède. C'est pour ça que ici c'est déjà un petit peu winter. I forgot. Yeah, envers, c'est envers, exactement. Et c'est pour ça que je suis habillé comme ça. Mais oui, je vais parler aujourd'hui sur le problème de l'ancrage dans les modèles de langage qu'on a aujourd'hui dans l'intelligence artificielle. C'est du travail que j'ai fait avec Raphaël Millière, qui est aussi là aujourd'hui. Puis, je vais présenter des travaux que j'avais fait seul, mais qui a des liaisons intéressantes, je pense, avec le problème de l'ancrage. Et je vais aussi, une partie de la présentation est exactement sur comment on peut donner des définitions de l'ancrage. So,
but do that in English so everybody understands.
Yeah, sorry. So I'm going to be talking about work partially that I've done jointly with Raphaël Millière, who is also present here, That's going to be the first part, which covers the grounds of the paper that Stephen mentions. And then I'm going to move to the second part, which is work that I've done by myself, but that has interesting relationships to this previous work with Raphaël. And part of the first part, or the initial part of the presentation, is going to go exactly into the problem of how to understand grounding. What does it mean? So following the invitation that Stephen has made about how to define grounding. So that's going to be covered. So just be patient for a few minutes and I'm going to get there. And we're going to see that actually we think there are several different notions of grounding and we are going to be focusing only on one. All right, so moving to then the outline, which I've sort of already anticipated. So part one is going to be covering the vector grounding problem, so the paper that I wrote with Raphaël. So we're going to be talking briefly, because I suppose you're all very familiar with this, about the symbol grounding problem. Then I'm going to introduce again very briefly artificial language models. And then we're going to be talking about, or I'm going to be talking about, the many senses of grounding. And we're going to focus on one specific sense of grounding that we think is particularly interesting, at least for our purposes in this paper. And we're going to try and show that there are good reasons to believe that some or a subset of LLMs, or large language models that we have today, do have that specific kind of grounding. Then in part two, I'm going to move towards perhaps even more speculative territory, and I'm going to talk about what I call functional ontologies. So this is within the project of trying to understand AI systems, but here in this talk, I'm going to focus especially on large language models. And we've seen in the past few years that there are at least two contraposed, or well, actually complementary, but very different approaches to understanding LLMs. One is benchmarking, another is mechanistic interpretability. And I'm going to argue that something is missing, that we need something in between these two approaches to understanding large language models. And I'm going to take the cue here from cognitive science, and especially recent work on cognitive ontologies. And I'm going to apply that to artificial systems. And that's why I choose the less fraught term of functional ontologies. Then I'm going to provide an illustration about how this sort of approach can shed some light on what's going on in LLMs. And I'm going to come to conclusions by bringing all of this back to the question of grounding. All right, so much for introduction. So as I think Stephen mentioned, I would rather take questions at the end of the talk, and feel free to ask them in French if you're more comfortable with that, and I'll try my best to answer in French if you wish, otherwise in English if that's better for recording purposes. All right, so the vector grounding problem. So this is joint work with Raphaël Millière. He's also here, as I mentioned. So very quickly, the symbol grounding problem, a very rough way of putting it, is basically the question of, well, how can internal symbols reach out to the world? Reach out is, of course, a metaphor that we need to cash out better. One way to do so is to transform it into the question, how can internal symbols be about the world? Now, as you know, the symbol grounding problem, as it has been proposed by Stephen, has some intuition bumps that lead to, this intuition that there is a problem here and that there is something missing in systems that do not have a certain sort of relationship to the world that allows those internal symbols to have aboutness. So we have the famous Chinese room proposed by John Searle in the 80s, and we have, which I think is a better example, actually a better intuition bump, Stephen's Chinese dictionary. So I think you're all familiar with that, so I'm not going to go into those. But the basic idea is that, well, if you have a system that is just a bunch of symbols relating to other symbols, symbols being transformed into other symbols, you never reach out to the world. So it's not possible that these symbols have any meaning just because they have no connection to the world. They are just symbol to symbol connections. And the original problem, of course, was mostly directed against classical AI approaches, so symbolic AI. But we are going to show that a similar issue also appears for connectionist networks that instead of using symbols classically understood in their representations, use vectors or these huge lists of numbers, basically. All right, so let's move to that. So large language models, or LLMs, and the vector grounding problem. So let's look a little bit at what artificial language models are and what are the underpinnings of the whole project. Again, very quickly, because I suppose most of you are quite knowledgeable about this stuff. So one of the underlying ideas there, especially with connectionist-based artificial language models, is the so-called distributional hypothesis. So the idea that words that occur in a similar context have a similar meaning. And we see that using this sort of assumption has led to radical improvements in artificial language processing models, starting with the deep learning revolution, so-called. So about 2012 onwards, and that's the AI spring that we are still living through. Let's see how long it's going to last. So the idea is that artificial language models acquire semantic capabilities by tapping into the distributional statistics of words that they acquire from training on huge corpora of text. So by means of that training, the idea is that they are able to induce general syntactic and semantic properties of language. And this seems to be sufficient. We see this empirically when we interact with such systems. It is sufficient to perform many downstream linguistic tasks near, or at least near, or at human level, sometimes even better than human level. All right, so in light of all that, is there a similar problem as the symbol grounding problem for these systems as well, even though they do not use classical symbols as representational means, but rather vectors? So these lists of numbers that are then multiplied and so on and so forth. So basically what LLMs do is that they encode words, or rather tokens or bits of words, as vectors. And these are huge vectors that live or occupy, so to speak, a high dimensional space. And these vector positions reflect in this space, of course, it's an abstract space or a mathematical space, reflects statistical or distributional properties of the words that the system has been trained on. But then comes, a similar sort of worry as with the classical AI systems. The worry is, well, these vectors, they do not reflect the meaning of words, right? Because all these systems were trained on was just texts. They had no access to the world itself, right? So they are not grounded in some sense in the world. All they have is just text to work with. So they cannot acquire any sort of meaning from just looking at text, and nothing else. Right, so let's first, so before delving more deeply into the vector grounding problem, let's try to figure out what's the problem of grounding actually is. And we think that it's actually many different problems, and which itself is a problem, because then it leads to people talking past each other. So we think that bringing some conceptual clarity here is very important. So, as I mentioned, there is this very intuitive sense of grounding that is some sort of connection between a state, a process, be it a symbol, be it a vector, be it something external like a map or a word on a page, and something in the world. So we have lots of representations that can be connected to the world, in such a way. But of course, we have to look at, well, what sense of connection are we talking about? And we are going to see that depending on how we understand the relevant notion of connection, we end up with different notions of grounding that are importantly different from each other. So here we go. So the first one that Raphaël and I have identified is what we call referential grounding. So it's basically anchoring linguistic representations to their worldly reference. So making it so that a certain linguistic representation refers to something out there in the world. Then we have sensory motor grounding, that is connecting a linguistic representation to a sensory motor representation. And that kind of grounding has been much discussed, for example, in cognitive neuroscience with people like Lawrence Barcelou and Friedman Puvermüller, sorry, trying to argue for grounded conceptual representations in terms of them being dependent on representations in sensory motor areas of the brain. Then we have relational grounding, which is the idea that linguistic representations are connected to other linguistic representations. So a little bit like in a dictionary. We also have communicative grounding, which is a sort of, or partially the sort of grounding that, for example, exercises Emily Benter and Alexander Koller in their famous paper, Climbing Towards Natural Language Understanding. And the idea here is basically that grounding is a matter of coordinating shared meanings in terms of speaker intentions and so on and so forth in linguistic interactions. Finally, we can talk about epistemic grounding, sometimes discussed in computer science as well, in terms of connecting a linguistic representation to a certain knowledge base in which more information about the reference of that representation can be found. And then in light of what Stephen has published in the past and also mentioned in the last week's talk, we can also perhaps talk about Harned's grounding, which is something like, paraphrasing something that Stephen said last week, picking out reference of linguistic representations and being able to interact appropriately with them by means of using sensory motor systems like sensing and limbs and interacting motorically with the reference. So arguably, the sense of grounding that Stephen is talking about is something that mixes up or brings together what we've been calling referential grounding, sensory motor grounding, and epistemic grounding. Now, let's look at the relationships now between these different senses of grounding and whether they are, enough to get us going with the whole grounding problem. So it seems clear, I think, that sensory motor grounding, as we have defined it, is not enough insofar as it's a matter of grounding in further representations, right? So we are grounding conceptual linguistic representations on representations that are sensory motor representations, but still representations which raise the question of, well, how do those sensory motor representations get to be about worldly entities in their turn? And just very quickly, especially for the philosophers among you, there is perhaps the temptation, so to speak, of going for a naive resemblance theory, but there are several good philosophical reasons not to go there, which I'm not going to go into here in this talk. Then what's the issue with relational grounding? Well, again, similar to the previous one, we are here grounding linguistic representations on just further linguistic representations. So we are not, so to speak, leaving the representational merry-go-round and reaching out into the world, right? We are just looking at more representations. So, and then there is the further question of, well, if you have a coherent system of language-to-language relations, what makes it so that a specific system comes to be appropriate to the world if it's somewhat insulated or has no contact with that world? And communicative grounding, of course, things like communicative intent and shared common grounds rely, arguably, on internal representations. And then we have again the question, well, how do these internal representations that speakers and interlocutors have in their minds, how do they get to be about things out there in the world? So an aside here, so there are some minority positions in philosophy that think that something like socially based theories of aboutness may work. So that's a line that one may take, but it's not a mainstream line, and there are several issues with those sorts of theories. But I just wanted to signal that here, but we are not going to go into that at all. And then, of course, we have epistemic grounding, and again, knowledge bases are composed of representations, and then we have the further question, well, how do these representations in these knowledge bases get to be about worldly entities? So it seems that only referential grounding is the one that is really basic in all of this. So it's the only one that is able to connect representations, or is interested in the question of how representations can be connected to the world rather than to other representations. And referential grounding is a subject matter, and has been for several decades, of theories of representational content in philosophy of cognitive science. And as I try to suggest right now, referential grounding is presupposed by, or a component of, for example, in what we call harned grounding, of other forms of grounding. So we argue that this is the basic sense of grounding that is relevant for the basic question of aboutness or intrinsic meaning. So how a representation, a symbol, a vector, a word, a map can be about something other than itself, something out there in the world, independent of how any interpreter takes that symbol. So that's what makes it intrinsic, rather than something that is imposed from outside by an interpreter, which is an extrinsic kind of meaning. And by the way, that's the objection that Bender and Kohler make to current LLMs, saying that the meaning they may have is only extrinsic meaning, is meaning that is being imposed by outside, by us interpreting strings of symbols in certain ways, rather than meaning that is there in the system itself, regardless of any interpreters. All right, very important. So to avoid any risk of misunderstanding. So by claiming that a system is referentially grounded in the world, we are not claiming that the system has understanding, that the system is capable of reasoning, or that the system has any sort of metacognitive capacity. Referential grounding does not require nor entail any of those things, any of these richer, more complex capacities. Of course, it's very plausible that something like referential grounding is a necessary condition for any system that is able to have abilities that have to do with understanding, reasoning, and metacognition, but it's definitely not sufficient for those. So just to be clear, everything that we're going to talk about, and I'm going to talk about for the rest of this talk, is exclusively about referential grounding. So it's neutral on understanding, reasoning, metacognition, and all of that. Right, so I mentioned that referential grounding has been something that philosophers have been interested in, well, if we want to be charitable, for a couple of centuries, but work has become particularly intense, especially during the 80s and to this day. So there are books and articles being written about how to make sense of representational grounding to these days, and this takes the form of theories of representational content. So what makes it so that representations, so states with contents, get to have contents which are basically what something is about. So it's basically the question of what endows a representation with this aboutness, this feature of being about something else. something other than itself, of reaching out of itself to touch, so to speak, whatever it is that it is a representation of. So the questions that philosophers have been asking are questions such as, well, what makes something into representation? So what makes something be endowed with content? One huge constraint in the mainstream, at least, when it comes to theories of content in philosophy, is naturalism, which is actually two constraints. So one constraint is that we do not appeal to anything magical or that cannot be accounted for by science, including biology. So not only, basic physics, but also the special sciences. And thus, any theory of content does not already presuppose representations or contents, because otherwise we end up in a circle, right? You want to explain how things can get contents to start with, so we cannot rely on the notion of content or on representations in our accounts. So this is the basic naturalism constraint. So there are a variety of available theories, such as informational semantics, cellular information semantics, conceptual semantics, stereosemantics, and so on and so forth. They disagree in some details, but there is a large consensus on the central factors that are required to endow something with content, to make something into a representation. And these central factors are causal interaction, and a history of selection or a history of learning. And this latter is supposed to provide standards of success. So something that makes so that a representation can be correct when it is actually capturing how things are in the world up there, and can be incorrect or a misrepresentation when it fails to capture the state of the world. So it is this history of selection and learning that is supposed to give systems world-involving functions. So functions that depend on how the world is, and therefore that make it so that representations have to be accurate in relation to how the world is. I'm being somewhat rough here, just for the interest of time, but just to give you a sort of idea of what's going on here in this literature. Now, let's now move to what we can say in light of these theories of content about large language models. So one idea, one proposal that has been put forward by some people in the literature, such as Raphaël, is that we can have some degree of grounding in LLMs from structure. After all, the representations that are produced by humans and that LLMs are trained on are highly organized in systematic ways. And these systematic ways depend or respond to, or our response to, how the world actually is. So there are some clear examples of this, especially within some specific linguistic domains, such as color names and directions. They seem to reflect structural information about the world, so color space, so the relationships between different colors, geographies, so relationships between different directions, just north, east, left, right, up and down, and so on and so forth. And that structural information is, of course, acquired by humans through interaction with the world or by learning, but it is there, reflected in the representation that we produce and that these systems are trained on. So the idea is that these language models may induce such structural information by learning from the statistics of human statements about the world, at least for what regards these somewhat limited domains. However, there is a problem with this, namely that, again, for complicated philosophical reasons, without causal historical relations to the world, structure by itself is insufficient. One of the perhaps more intuitive reasons for this is that structural mappings. So if you have two structures, a representation structure and a world structure, let's say of a domain, it's extremely easy to find mappings between these two, right? So that without very strong constraints on the specific kinds of mappings, you can always get isomorphisms between two different domains. So there is a problem there, because if this is the case, then we lose that sort of strict or strong standard of success, because any mapping can work in the end of the day if we don't have strong enough constraints. And the idea is that causal historical relations are the ones that give us these constraints, that make it so that structural mappings are not so liberal. Now, to the more positive parts, so grounding from structure by itself may not be enough, may be part of the story, but let's look at the other components that we mentioned earlier about what endows representations with content, namely causal historical relations to the world. So one idea that we suggest in our work is that, well, in the case of LLMs, the representations are produced by learning from representations that are ultimately grounded in the world through the history of causal interactions between humans and the world, right, and worldly entities. Since those representations are the representations that LLMs are trained on. And it's important to keep in mind that in this case, the causal historical relations are indirect, right? They are not directly with the world, but through the mediation of human representations. But that's not unlike several, the common case also in humans, right? So lots of the word meanings and concepts that we acquire not from direct interaction with whatever the representation is about, but from testimony or social learning, right? I mean, I never interacted with a black hole, for example, and I hope none of you have, but when I say black hole, I'm referring to black holes through testimony and social learning. In this case, learning about theories and that scientists have about what black holes are, and so on and so forth. The example I tended to use before was about the northern lights that I had never seen until March this year, but I knew what they were, even though I have had no direct contact with northern lights before. But I can't use this example anymore because I actually saw them in March. They are very beautiful, by the way. So if you have a chance to see them, do grasp it. Right, so here, even in the case of humans, we have, for many concepts and representations, this sort of indirect causal historical grounding through chains of social transmission. So from the person with a certain knowledge, or in the case of the Northern Lights, with causal contact with the reference to other language users in the linguistic community. So there is nothing so unlike there. Lots of our own concepts and representations in LLMs when it comes to this indirect kind of causal historical relations to the referent. Now, trick here to account for is world-involving functions. So what they require to have a world-involving function for a system is that the standards for task success for the system hinge on how the world is, or a domain of the world is. Now, as I'm sure you know, the proximate function or the immediate function in LLMs is just next token prediction. And this is an infralinguistic task, so not a good candidate for world-involving standards of success. But then if we look at more than the immediate functions, for example, if you look at the functions that these systems are called to perform when we give them a task by textually interacting with them, we can have other more interesting kinds of functions that vary with the prompts, with the textual input we give to the system. And here we can have world-involving functions coming from different mechanisms. So one of them, much discussed lately in the past months, and especially, is in-context learning. So this capacity, or apparent capacity of LLMs to learn tasks through the textual inputs that we give them that were not there in the training data set. So were not there in pre-training. Another one, also becoming more and more popular, and that powers some of the most famous systems nowadays, such as ChatGPT and Claude, is reinforcement learning through human feedback. The basic idea is that here is that there is a fine-tuning step that I'm going to briefly talk about a bit later on. But let's first go into in-context learning. So it's still somewhat unclear what's going on there. So what makes it so that LLMs are able to do this? There are different hypotheses, some of which with quite some empirical backing. So one that I forgot to add here is induction heads that have been posited by Chris Oller's lab. Then there is virtual gradient descent that lots of people have been working recently. So the basic idea is that in some way, gradient descent, the learning algorithm has been embedded during pre-training in the weights of the system, so that the manipulation of data, so the vector operations and matrix operations that are performed are such that we end up with something that looks like gradient descent, even though no weights are updated during in-context learning. So for our purposes here, what is interesting is that we can see the pre-training as leading implicitly, so not intentionally, to a sort of meta-learning. So learning to learn, and this may be because one of the best ways to solve the next token prediction task when it comes, to this unimaginably huge corpora of data is to do something that has to do with learning on the go, so to speak, more specific tasks that are better fit to specific kinds of text, specific kinds of instructions, and so on and so forth. So we can see a meta-learning function during pre-training there, and instruction fine-tuning as well. And then that makes it so that there is a derived function in context to learn responses to each task that the system is asked to solve through the inputs that we give them when we are interacting with LLMs. So if that function that we give the system in context is world involving, so if it has something to do, or its standards of success have to do with how the world actually is, then there is a derived function in context learning that is world involving. So we get that sort of world involving function requirement that is needed for referential grounding according to our best theories of representational content. As I mentioned, another popular avenue here is to look at reinforcement learning through human feedback, which is increasingly popular fine-tuning methods. And it's basically, what it does is that it relies very roughly on human assessments of how adequate a certain output produced by the system is, on the basis of some predefined standards, which tend to be things like honesty or truthfulness, harmlessness, and helpfulness. So the 3 H's. And these evaluations are then used to train another model, which the original pre-trained and instruction-trained model is then trained by means of reinforcement learning. So that makes it so that truthness becomes part of what counts during learning. So there is a learning requirement that the outputs produced be truthful. So actually reflect how the world is. And that gives us, again, world-involving functions. So the requirements that we need for having the basic ingredients for grounding, namely for referential grounding. So causal contact with the world, albeit indirect, historic interaction with the world, similarly indirect, and world-involving functions, actually direct. Oops. So basically what we are arguing is that for the basic components for grounding, namely for referential grounding, are all there in a subset of large language models, especially those that go through some sort of reinforcement learning through human feedback, fine-tuning, or more speculatively, even those that only go through some sorts of implicit meta-learning process during pre-training, and that helps explain the capacity for in-context learning. Right, so that was the first part, covering the paper, vector grounding, the vector grounding problem with Raphaël, and now comes part 2, which is shorter. You'll be happy to hear, and that is independent from that work. And has not been published yet, so I'm looking forward to your comments about this as well. So the focus here, as I mentioned during the introduction, is on how to try and understand what's going on in LLMs. One very popular approach to that question is benchmarking. So coming up with benchmarks of tasks, or whole sets of tasks, and we evaluate the LLMs in terms of how well they do in those tasks, especially comparing them their performance with human performance on the same tasks. This has led to a proliferation of benchmarks for LLMs, such as Big Bench, with which Raphaël and I were also involved. And the benchmarking is very useful, of course, and there are at least 2 possible uses that can be made of that. So one is a more practical, pragmatic one. So if you are interested in figuring out whether a certain AI system, or more specifically a certain LLM, is good enough for a certain task, we can just, have that task as or that set of tasks in our benchmark and see whether they perform well, at least in comparison to humans in that task. Another possible use is to try and understand what capacities AI systems have. And this is somewhat of greater scientific and philosophical interest. And that's what I'm interested in this talk. So some limits, especially for what regards the theoretical parts or the theoretical use of benchmarking, is that, of course, it's purely behavioral. So it gives us limited insights under the hood of what's going on under the hood that makes it so that these systems are able to solve those tasks or have good performance in those benchmarks. And it can also be unclear what kinds of capacities the benchmarks probe. And I'm going to illustrate this later on in a bit, actually. And of course, it's also tricky to generalize to similar tasks. So for very good performance in a certain task that for us humans may seem intuitively very similar to another task, may actually not generalize to that similar task in, for us, surprising ways. Another very popular approach to understanding LLMs is mechanistic interpretability. And I've already mentioned the work by Chris Oler, for example, who has done great work on interpreting what's going on in LLMs, especially in the transformer architecture, with very good papers from a couple of years ago and one from last year, especially. So the focus here is on the mechanistic functioning of the AI architecture. So what is that they are doing computationally that allows them to do what they do? So questions that are asked are things like, well, how may LLMs do variable binding? How may they do syntactic and semantic composition? And to move away from LLMs, we can ask, well, how do convolutional neural networks trained for image recognition implement position-independent feature detectors? So we then look at the computational goings-on in those systems that allow them to show those capabilities. However, there are also limitations to this, especially when it comes to the large or gigantic models that we have nowadays. It's very difficult to use those sorts of methods to them just because they are too complex. So mechanistic interpretability is mostly applied to toy models, and then we try to generalize from those toy models to the large models, but of course there are limitations to how much you can generalize and how to justify those generalizations. So there are some epistemic issues here. So basically we have two things: benchmarks investigating purely behavioral performance, not looking under the hood; mechanistic interpretability looking under the hood, investigating the computational building blocks. But I want to argue that we're still missing something. We are missing a way to connect performance to mechanism and to look under the hood, but at the same time preserve generalization. And that's why I'm going to argue here for the rest of this talk that we should look at functional ontologies for AI. So if we look at cognitive comparative psychology, we see that we have different categories that are connected to each other in specific ways. So we can look at task performance, so at behavioral measures. We can look at the neural implementation, so we can look at brains and neurons firing and so on and so forth. But between those two sorts of approaches, we have cognitive psychology. So we look at cognitive functions. So something that a level of explanation that is above in terms of abstraction to neural implementation, but which is not just a matter of performance. So we talk about things like working memory or face recognition or other things like that. For example, in linguistic processing, we have, for example, mapping words to concepts and things like that. So all these sorts of capacities that we posit that are not talking about neurons necessarily, and that are just not just a matter of behavioral performance, but help explain behavioral performance, and which the neural details help explain in the turn. So there is no explanatory independence here. And I want something similar for large pre-trained AI models, such as LLMs and CNNs. So something that helps fill this explanatory gap here between benchmark tests and mechanistic implementation. And I think we can take the cue from cognitive ontology here. So this is a literature that started in neuroscience, looking for function structure mappings in the brain, but it evolved into broader questions about the right categories, the right ontologies for cognition. So what kinds of cognitive functions are there, and how do they relate to each other? But as I mentioned at the beginning, cognitive may be problematic to apply to current AI systems. So maybe there may be too much baggage there. So I actually prefer to talk about functional ontologies. I'm going to say that, well, this is what fills the gap between, or is it this intermediate explanatory level between benchmarks and mechanistic interpretability. So functional capacities explain benchmark performance. They are more abstract than mechanistic implementational details, and therefore more generalizable. And they are multiply realizable in several directions. So different functional capacities may lead to the same benchmark success, and that's something that we find in humans as well. Different mechanistic implementation can lead to the same functional capacity, again, something very common in neuroscience. And different benchmark successes can now actually rely on the same functional capacity, again, very common in cognitive psychology. So let me give a brief illustration of something that we did with Raphaël Millière, Catherine Stinson, and Charles Rathkopf for the big benchmark that I mentioned earlier, which was this conceptual combinations task. So we asked questions like, the word bucklo means any animal that is furry and has 4 legs, and the word cluster means a simple sort of dwelling. Question, which of the following sentences best characterizes bucklo clusters? And the choices were these here that you see on the screen. So bucklo clusters of domestic animals are normally furnished with armchairs, sorry for the typo there, and desktop computers, or high-end houses are objects humans live in. And the system has to give the right answer. And I hope you agree that is the first one here. Interestingly, GPT-3 and same generation LLMs were very bad at this task, And these were the systems that we had access to during designing this task. But we get human comparable performance from Palm on. How? Right? What does this fact mean? And then we have to ask the question then, what tasks does the benchmark involve? Our goal in designing the task was to try and probe semantic composition capabilities that require world knowledge, that are not just a matter of the strict meaning of each one of the concepts involved in the definitions that we gave, using completely invented words to avoid their presence in the presence of the task in the pre-training data set. But maybe there are other options that we didn't consider, such as complex semantic association, something like informed guessing, or something else that I can't even imagine. So we may have two different hypotheses about what's going on there. One of those is perhaps the more intuitive for us, that what's going on there is some sort of semantic syntactic composition that is used to store knowledge about the world. So you can do something like this: replace the invented words with the definitions that were provided, access the semantics of those definitions, put those definitional concepts together, compose their meaning, access the relevant world knowledge, update the meaning of the definitions, infer by combination the meaning of the conceptual combination that was invented, and choose the answer compatible with that meaning. But there is another hypothesis, namely that what they are doing is something associative and non-compositional. So the procedure might be, for each invented word, attach words following means in phrase, add elements of the latter representation, so the ones that follow means, to representations of the former, so the invented word, merge the two resulting representations, and we know that LLMs are very good at doing this, then probe in that high-dimensional space what is close in that space, right, in that complex vector space in which LLMs live. And then assign probabilities to the options by the strength or the closeness of their own vector clusters in this high-dimensional space, and then choose the answer with the highest probability. So what is going on, right, in the conceptual combinations task? Well, it's unclear, right? But it's unclear because different task and functional ontologies are expected or should be expected to apply to different kinds of systems, such as humans and LLMs. So perhaps hypothesis A applies to humans, hypothesis B to LLMs. We don't know. And then what I want to do in this final minute is to draw some conclusions from all that has gone on in these two parts of the talk. So as I mentioned, once we look at cognitive ontologies, especially when applied to systems like artificial systems, we should be prepared to the idea that there are different ontologies that we should use when describing and trying to understand those systems, because they are very different to us. So they have a different design. They underwent different pressures in their history, in this case, history of learning or of training. They have different learning regimens, so things like instruction, fine-tuning, rather than a sort of training and teaching that goes on in human education or in other animals' education as well, in interaction with their conspecifics. Different integration with other capacities, right? Human brains are complex. We have very different capacities that interact in complicated ways: visual, motor, linguistic, conceptual, and LLMs don't have all of those. So for this reason, it's very risky to rely on human categories and on human intuitions when we try to make sense of what these systems, these AI systems are doing. And this goes back to the question of grounding as well. So referential grounding may be achieved very differently in LLMs and in humans. So I already mentioned the distinction between direct and indirect causal historical relations. There is also a difference when it comes to what endows those systems with world-involving functions. So instead of teaching, social interaction, social learning, like we have in humans, we may have some sort of meta-learning with derived functions in context learning, and the reinforcement learning of human feedback mechanism. And as I mentioned, there are very distinct collection of subsystems in human or biological brains in general, and LLMs and other narrow AI systems. But as we try to argue in the first part of the paper, of the talk, the required features for referential grounding, namely the features that are required for a system to have aboutness or intrinsic meaning, are satisfied in LLMs. So I suggest that we should be pluralists about grounding and also about referential grounding, in light of the fact that, you know, these issues about ontologies varying between different kinds of systems. So LLM referential grounding is alien in the sense that it's very different from human, or somewhat different from human referential grounding, but still grounding. And to end with a more speculative note, one way of seeing AI as a scientific enterprise is exactly as that of creating systems that allow us to explore the space of possible functional ontologies that are able to solve tasks or perform tasks at human or superhuman level. All right, so I'll stop here. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Can you hear me, Dimitri?
Not so well. It's sort of the audio is not very good.
And can you hear me better when I'm speaking to right?
No, yeah, it's still quite bad.
Anybody help to make the speakers hear?
Oh, now it got better. Now it got better.
I don't know why.
Now it's better again.
Then I can sit down. Anyway, there will be questions, I'm sure. I would like you to put up your hands if you have a question using the raise hand function. And also here in the audience, if you have questions, just raise your hand and I'll address you. It usually takes a few minutes before people get bold enough to ask questions, so I have to make bold to ask a few myself.
But Steven, maybe you might try to raise the volume of the mic on your end, and maybe that will help with the sound.
Yeah, I have someone here else.
It's more like the sound is sort of fuzzy, so it's like the resolution is not so good. Resolution is not the right name for the right sound for audio, but that's sort of what's going on, I think. And I'm not hearing anything.
Right now, we're working on it. Not me, but someone who knows is working on it. Is that better? Okay. Is that okay? Is this better?
Yes, this is better, yeah.
Okay, we already have a question from Professor Achin, but let me do the kickoff anyway, to get context on it. What? Okay, good. I have a hypothetical question for you. Really reducing it down to basics. By the way, the second half of the talk, you're going to have to give a talk that's going to be only on that second half because it went by too fast to be fully processed.
Yeah, no, sorry for that. I tried to pack too much into this presentation.
But the first half gives enough food for thought.
Stephen, your camera is off.
Oh, should I change? What should be on?
No, the camera is on. It's because the computer that is being used is not the same as the one that is used for the camera of Steven.
But,
so you can see him when he's talking if you have the full screen.
Can you hear me if I'm talking?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so I can sit. Good. So let me just put it simply because I don't want to talk this space. Let's just for simplification, think of the ChatGPT LLM grounding problem in general, really literally in terms of an electronic dictionary, but a dynamic electronic dictionary. With the remarkable capacities of LLMs, If you ask it questions, it can put together those words. But basically, it's working with those words. There's many more words in the huge many parameter representation. But would you, with your the factors that you cited as being referential grounding, namely history and causal interaction, if you did that with a dictionary, an electronic dictionary, sort of a dictionary in which you could interact directly with the dictionary online and change the meaning and gremlins can't come and override your corrections. Would you call that interaction evidence of the fact that this online dictionary is grounded?
No, not really. I mean, the issue here is that is about the requirements that we mentioned, causal historical relations and world-involving functions. So one of the issues there is that the dictionary may not be rich enough in terms of information that it gives about the world. So it doesn't have enough structure in the textual expressions that it includes to allow any system to learn or to induce that interesting structure of the world from those. So we have human texts that talk about lots of different things, right? And so that go on very different subject matters. And that may also be a reason why one way to optimize for the next token prediction task is exactly to build something like a semantic model of the world, just because of the variety of texts that the system was trained on. Moreover, just looking at the dictionary, we don't get any world-involving function, right? We just have this closed language-to-language system. And if the tasks that we have the system do and that it is trained or is supposed to learn to do are not world-involving, but just infra-linguistic tasks, then it doesn't have the basic features required for referential grounding. Then if we should build a system like that, it doesn't matter what its behavior is. It may look like it's a very impressive behavior, but it does not have the building blocks for referential grounding, right? So that's why it's important not only to look at behavior and what we take to be surprising or impressive, because we are very biased and very limited in our imaginative capacities, but we have to look at the nuts and bolts of how the systems are built and how the systems are trained to actually be able to answer these kinds of questions. And in this scenario that you gave, there wouldn't be the required ingredients for referential grounding, which we think there are in LLMs, especially the ones that are trained with reinforcement learning through human feedback.
The reason that I chose just a dictionary, not a big one, but a small dictionary, is exactly to try to isolate what you're saying is what's missing, is causal historical part. But you answered by saying that there's lots of things dictionaries can't do. That doesn't answer my question. They're really limited compared to LLMs. But what would adding the factors that you think would make them grounded change? You answered in terms of what they can't do. That's not what it's about. Okay. I don't want to continue.
Right. So just to quickly say something about that, we are not talking about behavioral capacities here. So we can have two systems that behave identically, while one is referentially grounded, the other one is not. So when we talk about representations, we are not talking about changes in behavior. We cannot tell representations whether there are representations, whether there is aboutness, in many cases at least, just by looking at behavior. We have to look at what's going on in the system and how it came to be, right? So it's not a matter of effects that we see. It's a matter of the nature of the systems themselves.
I understand. This historicity on which you're putting a lot of weight, historicity, I'm calling into question. I'm not going to say anything more.
Well, I kind of want,
Speak very loud.
yeah, I kind of want to piggyback off of what you were saying and ask a third question. If we're talking about since addiction,
Can you hear?
So perhaps you can get closer to the microphone.
Maybe you could face the microphone. Where is the mic?
I'm not sure at this point.
Okay, talk very loud.
Now it's somewhat better. And by the way, Raph Millière is here. So Raph, if you want to add anything, just feel free to jump in.
So I kind of want to piggyback on what Stefan was asking about dictionary and ask it in a specific like idea of it. Let's suppose I was creating a dictionary, but I was making about a simple word like I'm gonna go and create a dictionary about the term for a university. So I ask all the students, I get the information, and I interpret the context to what I write. So I don't do it all literally. I do it based on the training data itself. So I do it not as an LLM, it's way more limited and it's physical. At that point, would I not have the historical causal effect and the world evolving function at that point, since I based it about how the world interacts itself, even if it's not at the size of LLM and doesn't have the emergent by itself, since I pre-baked it into my first question when I created the word.
Right, so I'm not sure I got all of that. But yeah, you can create, I think, LLMs with more limited vocabulary and more limited data sets that may make it so that they are grounded, so they are referentially grounded only in respect to certain specific domains and not others. So referential grounding in LLMs can also be piecemeal, so to speak, depending on the details of history, training, and so on and so forth. So if I get the question correctly, that would be the answer, right? So it's not a yes or no question, either referential grounding in general or no referential grounding at all. But we can also have cases in which there is referential grounding for some representations, but not others. And this is going to depend on the details about the system itself.
We go back in a second. Shai has been waiting for a while. You'll come back to you. André, tu entends?
Yes, oui, j'espère que ma voix est plus claire. Moi aussi, j'utilise le microphone de mon ordinateur. Est-ce que c'est clair?
Oui, c'est clair. Ouais.
Okay. Okay. You mentioned emotional grounding, and I want to report to you a sentence that Al Bregman, in psychology at McGill in the early 80s, I guess, said about the valence of a sentence could not be the valence of the individual words. And the sentence, what would be the state of mind of a man who says, my best friend is making love to my wife? In terms of vectors, that it's all the vectors of the individual words are pointing in positive valence, but my wife or his wife would change the direction. So if a system was to represent the truth of the situation, that what you have as a criterion should correspond to the word, would that necessarily involve human intervention to tell the system that other men are not supposed to make love to your wife? Or like what would be the requirement for grounding correctly? And because it doesn't depend on any individual word, it depends on my wife or his wife.
Right, so we didn't talk about emotional grounding here. Perhaps it's something that we should add as the list of senses of grounding that might exist. But it's a very interesting question. So definitely there is not enough information just in the sentence. But the thing is that, you know, these systems have been trained on huge amounts of texts, including, you know, novels and stuff like that, which those sorts of things happen.
So
and
you think there's a faint chance that the LLM system would get it correctly?
Yes, I think it's very, very likely, and I think it's also empirically shown. I didn't try exactly that scenario, but I'm pretty sure if you ask ChatGPT or Claude, you are going to get answers that are correct. That this is undesirable, or that goes against, that is a sort of betrayal, etc., etc. But that's not because of the content of the sentence itself or just by itself, because that's not all the system is relying on, right? It's relying on all of those, all of that information that it has taken from, being trained on novels and blog posts and Facebook posts.
That's
and
some
stuff
form
like that.
of grounding then, from learning itself, from the structure of the text that it read.
Right. Well, it depends on. So if you think that in-context learning is really a thing and it goes in the way that we said, so if you ask the system about emotions, then its emotion terms are going to be referentially grounded in human emotions. That does not mean that the system has emotions. It just means that when it outputs something like
Yes.
and is going to be sad refers to the feeling of sadness or the sentiment of being sad. But of course, not the LLM itself has no feelings, right? And it has no understanding of sadness either. Our point is just that it's able to refer to sadness in that specific example. So in that sense, it is referentially grounded in the world when it comes to emotions.
Yeah, I have other points, but I'll let other people intervene if there's a silence at some point. I'll come back with something else. Thank you.
And of course, I mean, if there is no time to get all your questions and so on and so forth, please feel free to just write me an email or something with your questions. I'm happy to answer them if I can. I'm writing my email on the Zoom chat in case you want to use that.
Okay, thank you. We'll go back to you if there's someone else. I don't see other hands, so I want to allow you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that what I was talking about was just based on the rule that you've given. It seems like you should just create a reference grounding based on the book itself. Like I could write a book that is completely referential grounded, and it would still work with the condition that you put on.
Right. So again, unfortunately, the audio is not so good. But is the point that we could train an LLM on a single book, and that would be enough for grounding?
So it seems that based on the rule the grounding you gave us, we could create something that is not an LLM and still have that kind of emergent will-involving function. So they seem
Yeah, definitely.
LLM and referential grounding, but more in general how we process knowledge.
Right. So of course, the points we are making about referential grounding, they are general. So the primary interest of the philosophers working on this question was actually humans and other animals. So those requirements that I talked about are the requirements that apply to humans, to dogs, cats, lions, tigers, giraffes, and so on and so forth. So it's a general thing. Now, when it comes to books, the thing is that books by themselves don't learn, right? They are not dynamic in that sense. They don't change, right? You cannot pose a question to the book, so it does not do any in-context learning either. So there are requirements there having to do with having undergone some sort of selection process, being able to learn, etc., that are part of what is required for something to, be able to be referentially grounded, as biological systems, or most biological systems are.
Raphaël, do you want to make a comment?
No, I just don't have my camera, but I don't have really anything to add to that particular response, or really anything Dimitri has said so far. I mean, I'm fully on board with every answer. So if there's any additional question, happy to chime in, but so possible.
Well, you disappeared. Does anyone else have a question? Maybe if you want to continue with what you were.
Well, I was trying to make links between what the LLMs do these days and what Margie did in the 70s or early 80s, I guess. Roger Shanks, is that still known, or like there was this conversation thing, but it was a small system, but they had something that the system could understand some limited language, and it could operate in paraphrase mode or in inference mode. In paraphrase mode, if you gave the input, Peter strangled Mary, the system could have given you back Peter strangled Mary, but he could say Peter grabbed Mary by the neck, and Mary died because she couldn't breathe. That was the paraphrase mode, and just so that the idea is that the understanding was some internal representation, and the language was just trying to express the internal representation. And in the inference mode, an example was John told Mary that Peter wants a book, and the system would reply, a book about what? Because the idea of if someone wants a book, there's some reason. So is that something that is being, is that something parallel like that is going on these days with LLMs and testing and trying to infer out what is the internal working cognitive learning, internal working, yes.
Right, so there is quite some work on trying to figure that out within this mechanical interpretability literature. So some of the posits that I hinted at, things like induction heads, or virtual gradient descent and things like that, they are all going towards that direction of trying to figure out, well, what is going on there. They tend to be not at the cognitive level, they tend to be at a more basic computational level, and that's part of what I was driving at in the second half of the talk, right? That we need something in between, so to come up with the sorts of potentially weird categories that are going to be better able to capture whatever is going on in the systems at this more cognitive level of description. When it comes to the systems you mentioned and what's going on right now, there is also some interest in trying to hybridize LLMs with things that are more symbol-like, so more related to these past approaches to AI. So there is some talk about neurosymbolic AI, in which people are trying to create systems that have both what we get from purely connectionist architectures and what we get from rule-based computations that were typical of classical AI. So there is this sort of divide, if you wish, in the fields between those that think, well, connectionism is all we need, and that is going, we just need to find better architectures, and then we're going to perhaps build different architectures together, making so that it has more general abilities. And those that think, well, certain things like, say, compositionality, or the sorts of potentially indefinite productivity that human thinking has, can only be achieved by something like rule-based computation. So these discussions are ongoing right now, but nothing that we said in this talk decides one way or the other, or tends one way or the other. It just tries to put some more emphasis on the fact that there are questions that we need to ask that we may not be asking right now, especially about this mid-level of description. Do you want to add something, Ralph?
There's a question in the chat that I'd like to say out loud to you. What implications or fulfillment has what you presented about historical causal interactive criteria? What implications do they have, if any, for understanding which you need help?
None, basically. So
is that a good thing? Or is that something you're proud of, or is that a problem?
No, it's good because it's very important to keep separate things separate, right? So mixing things together is a problem, because then we fail to see how answers to different issues may be different, right? So the question of understanding is another one, and the notion of understanding itself is being investigating a lot in philosophy currently, also in philosophy of science when it comes to scientific understanding, and there are different accounts. So one thing that is part often of the everyday use of the notion of understanding, for example, involves things like consciousness or being aware, or involve things like detecting errors or being able to think about your own thoughts and think, metacognitively on whether you really grasp something or not. And we deny, or we are not claiming at least, that anything like that is going on in LLMs, or at least we have not argued for any of that. All we've argued for is the claim that the representations that the system's output have intrinsic meaning. So they are not just meaningless strings of symbols that we as humans interpret as words and texts, as sentences, as they are actually meaningful in themselves because they are referentially grounded in the ways we said. The question of understanding is very interesting, but it's just not one that we were interested in this paper.
I'm not sure whether mixing, as you say, of things is such a bad idea. It's probably a good idea to integrate things with things. But the original intuition, it didn't come from me in Searle's paper, had to do with when he said he meant meaning for whom. He wanted to exclude the fact that whatever meaning there was there was in the head of the interpreter or the user. Well,
Exactly.
so you found another criterion to load it on, causality, interaction. But to me, at any rate, with the original motivation, that seems sort of vaguely platonic. Yeah, maybe it has the right causal structure and it may interact in a certain way, but you said that the live Wikipedia is not a good example. But maybe it's not a deficit that it brings consciousness into it. It certainly was there all along with me, and I think it was also there with Searle in the question. So you can't solve the problem of grounding if you ignore the problem of understanding. Because if you solve the
that's what we deny. That's what we deny. So that may be the case for harness grounding, perhaps, as we defined it, but not for referential grounding. And indeed, the sense of meaning that we're talking about here is not the everyday notion of meaning that we talk about when we talk about, well, I actually meant this other thing, or, this is meaningful for me. This, language is messy. Natural language is messy. The sense of meaning that we are talking about here, of aboutness, is the same sense of aboutness that makes it so that simple cells in V1, or rather complex cells in visual cortex 1, represents the presence of edges in the environment. So that's the same sense of meaning that we are claiming LLMs also have. So not the much more fraught, much richer notion of meaning that is involved in understanding. And one of the big problems, of the many problems in that paper by Searle, in which he presented the Chinese room experiment, is that he just mixes up lots of things. So he talks about understanding, never defines clearly what he means by it. He then begs lots of questions when he is replying to the possible objections. So, the philosophical literature has basically buried lots of that paper and found lots of failures with that sort of intuition bump. So, and that's one of the reasons why I think your own, the Chinese dictionary one, is much better than Searle's and much less confused than his is.
Steve Hansen, you want to turn on your face?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm having trouble hearing you, Stephen. So I haven't heard a lot of your questions, but maybe I'll repeat some of them here. So I've been involved in connections of neural networks for 40 some years, too long. And like Jeff Hinton and Yoshio, I'm a little nervous about what's happening because we don't understand it. And although I found your talk really interesting and logical, and you've laid out the issues, I'm not sure what your conclusions are, because I understand there are different kinds of grounding in the framework you presented, which is interesting. But are you saying that let's say GPT-4 right now in the form of its particular configuration is grounded in one of the terms you've used, or more importantly, if there are conditions under which these systems have actual sensory motor input at some point and perceptual construction, i.e. robot bodies and so on. Is that a different kind of grounding in your framework?
Right, great question. I just added a few links to papers I mentioned. These are both papers from Chris Ola's lab, in which they do very, very good mechanistic interpretability work, and they push a lot against this idea that we don't understand LLMs. They actually point out that we do understand lots of things about what's going on. Lots of things we don't understand yet, but we have a pretty good idea of what they are. It's very good.
Sorry, that's just not true. Nobody knows what's going on inside of these. There's no knowledge.
Well, we do to a certain extent,
No,
and there is ongoing work. I mean,
I gotta stop you because this is just incorrect. There's
no, that's not.
What's going on? What's
I'm afraid you are wrong there. So I really suggest that you take a look at these
don't
papers.
think you know what's
that
inside of these things or how they work. That doesn't make sense. Sorry.
Just a sec. Nobody gets to interrupt, okay? So whoever's speaking at the time, they go on. Go ahead right now.
Right. So yeah, when it comes to understanding, of course, we don't fully grasp, but there are lots of things that we don't fully grasp. But that does not mean that we are not making steps towards a better grasp of the systems. And the work by Ola and others is a very good illustration of that. So anyone interested in this, I suggest that you take a look at the links. For what regards the other question about different kinds of grounding. So definitely, if we add sensory motor, inputs or capabilities to the systems, we're going to have more information and more patterns that the systems can rely on during training to better, grasp whatever it is, whatever pattern is the right one for the specific task. But it can also enrich them by means of, for example, allowing them to have some sort of sensory motor grounding, and maybe perhaps even harness grounding in the future. So we are open to that. But in this paper, we are interested only in this very basic notion of referential grounding, and looking at whether it is there in LLMs, and we argue that it is there in a subset of them. But of course, there are systems that have been, and even ChatGPT 4 has some multimodal capabilities as well, especially visual. So there is more information there, even though it doesn't have ways to interact with it. There has been quite some work recently on trying to use LLMs as a sort of interface for robotic systems, so as to break down tasks for robotic systems and make the robots interact appropriately with their environments. So that's another way in which you can sort of use LLMs as a component in a larger AI system that has something more than just referential grounding, possibly at least.
We have to call it off because the time is up. I want to thank you very much. This is the second in the series, but the series is long. There's going to be 28 talks, including the Winter series. I hope you come back. I know that Raphael's coming back. And the last word has not been said. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the comments and for listening. Thanks.